Look like we got some new Spider-Man. Y'all already know this one of my favorite Spider-Man comic series too, so let's go check it out. Shout out to Spider-Man Noir. Noir. Black ass Spider-Man. Yeah.
So Spider Noir comes out today. So we're going to cover the first 4 issues of Spider-Man Noir, the original mini-series of Marvel Comics that gave us the origin and the backstory for his character. Now I will specify this was part of a larger storyline, for lack of a better word, that Marvel had, which was called Marvel Noir. And there were a whole lot of these. There was Luke Cage, there was Punisher, there was X-Men and more. And they all existed in this landscape that was basically during the Prohibition era. So it's a phenomenal story and a phenomenal line of comics. But what this does is this initially picks up with Ben Urich. And as most of you guys who are familiar with the Spider-Man mythos know, Ben Urich is a reporter for the Daily Bugle. And during the Prohibition era in this comic, he's very similar but different at the same time. And it kind of gives us this rundown to sort of set the stage for everything going on, where he says, 3 weeks ago, winter was setting in hard. Down below Riverside Drive, squatters had put up a shanty town. And so he's told by J. Jonah Jameson, get me pictures, but we're going to show the public what's really happening out there. I want broken men and hopeless women. I want snot-nosed kids in rags. I want to see the hunger in their eyes. I want pictures that will make them weep. And this is when we start to get the stage set for what life looks like here. Because at that point, you switch over to Aunt May. Now, unlike Aunt May in the main Marvel universe, who's this very kindly woman and in a lot of ways kind of maintains Peter Parker's moral compass to a degree, right? Why he always does what he does. During Spider-Man Noir, she's almost a kind of social revolutionary, right? Where she's addressing a crowd of people and she says, 3 years ago, Hoover was telling you that your jobs were secure for life. Since then, more than 13 million of you are out of work. We've seen the army on the streets using tanks and tear gas against citizens whose only crime is their poverty. Now, we've got Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt waiting to step into Hoover's shoes. But do you think there's going to be any real change? Republicans, Democrats, the only thing they're debating is the most efficient way to turn your sweat and blood into a profit. Now, of course, she's screamed at by this guy in a hat who will become important, where he says, get off your soapbox, Grandma. If you don't like the way that we run things in America, you should get on a boat and go join your comrades in Russia. Because what she's calling for here is effectively an end of capitalism and the beginning of socialism or communism within the United States. And she just tells him, young man, the last time I looked, the Constitution of this country protected my right to freedom of speech. And so this guy addresses another person with a name Ox and just says, pull her down, right? Get her out of here. And at that point, Peter Parker jumps in. Now, Peter's young. He's somewhat naive, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, because he does what he can to protect Aunt May, which isn't really the naive part. That's the heroic part. But of course, it ends up leading to a fight between all these guys, and that's when Ben Urich shows up with his camera in hand and says, do you boys want to see your mugs all over the Bugle tomorrow, or are you going to back off and let these people go about their business? And it's not as though they're afraid of the press. I mean, they really approach him with the intention of attacking him. But then one of these guys says he's off limits. So Ben Urich, for whatever reason, just cannot be touched by anybody here. And while they do talk about the idea of destroying, Ben Urich, ultimately they just end up walking away. And so at that point, you switch over to Aunt May and Ben and Peter when they get back to where Aunt May basically resides, or at least where she works out of, which is the Bowery Welfare Center. Now, it's not grandiose, right? This is a very modest building, and it's very small. And that's where Urich just kind of makes this offhanded remark. So this is the hotbed of the revolution, right? This small little welfare center. And that's where Aunt May actually makes a really good point here, right? We are what we say, a welfare center. We give the homeless a hot meal and a place to come in out of the cold. And he says, right, it seems a little too much socialism for some people. And at that point, Peter Parker chimes in and points over and says, do you see those screens? We put them up after my Uncle Ben was killed by the Goblins mob. And of course, Ben just tells him, look, I'm sorry to hear about that. But at the end of the day, Aunt May kind of cuts in and says, Peter, we don't know that it was the Goblins people that that killed your Uncle Ben. There's no way to know for sure. And so this is what's really interesting about both Peter and Aunt May in all of this, because Aunt May, in running this welfare center, she's an actual activist. She's not a person, it's just saying someone needs to do something, and by someone, I mean somebody else. No. She's actually doing it, right? She's actually out there in the world impacting and making a meaningful change. So when Ben Urich shows up here and starts making smart aleck remarks, well, what can you really say, right? I mean, what's he doing to make the world better, right? Or is he one of those where he just kind of judges people who does things that he doesn't? It's one of these weird and wonky aspects of his character, and we'll learn more about him as we go through. But for Peter, he's young and he's reckless, right? He is so confident that the Goblin's guys did something to his uncle. He's so sure of himself. There's no real evidence to indicate that, but he kind of treats his hunch, his theory, as an absolute truth, which is actually one of the coolest ways to present Peter in Marvel. And so what ends up happening is Aunt May just kind of goes back inside, frustrated with the whole idea and what's been happening over the course of the night. And Peter makes this comment where he says, damn it, right? Why do those gangsters come after us? It's the system that we're attacking, the banks, the businesses, and the politicians. Why do those guys care? And Ben Urich, in hearing about it all, just asked Peter, are you allowed out after midnight, right? And what he ends up doing is taking him to basically this nightclub. And he tells him, right, I hope you're not a prohibitionist, Peter, right? You're about to enter the hottest speakeasy in town. Because for those of you guys who don't know, prohibition was an era in the United States when alcohol was illegal. And so speakeasies rose to prominence as a place where people could go and drink alcohol, albeit do it underground. But there's a reason why Ben brought Peter here. The first is that Peter's introduced to Felicia Hardy, who will go on to become one of the most important people in the story. But the second thing is to actually show Peter what's going on. Peter's young, he's naive, he believes he has it all figured out, right? He's kind of the quintessential example of like somebody in their 20s who thinks they can solve the world's problems, all the while never bothering to ask themselves if the world's problems could be so easily solved by a bunch of 20-year-olds. Why aren't they solved yet? Because you're not thinking of anything that hasn't already been thought of before. Now, there is something to be said about that kind of vigor and somewhat arrogance that comes with youth, because that's how change happens. But for Ben Urich in his conversation with Peter, he tells him, I like you, and I like your Aunt May. I don't want to see you getting hurt, and the way you're going, it looks like you will be. And Peter kind of cuts him off, and he says, so you think she should keep her mouth shut, right? She believes in something. I believe in something. And Ben says, sure, you believe that there's good guys and bad guys, right and wrong. You believe that if we all become good little socialists and work for the greater good, everything will be sunshine and roses. And Peter's just kind of like, yeah, I mean, that's basically it. And Ben just tells him, that's a hell of a dream. And he says, look around here, Peter, look around this bar, because this is the reality, right? Do you see that big guy wrestling with the brunette? That's Jimmy Strider, the mayor of the city. To his left, Chief Detective Ryan from Vice Squad. The guy that he's smoozing with is Emilio Alcuno. He runs half the brothels in New York. And then we have Adolphus Crane, the industrialist. Your uncle helped organize demonstrations that closed down 3 of his sweatshops last year. And the man that's making his big entrance here is Norman Osborn, the Goblin. You wanted to know why the Goblin was coming after you. The Goblin doesn't personally give a damn about you or your aunt or anybody else. He's freelance. He works for the highest bidder. They use him because it wouldn't look good to have the police suppressing freedom of speech. And so Peter asked the question, are you saying the mayor hired the Goblin to kill my Uncle Ben? And that's where Ben just kind of breaks it down and says Alcuno probably did the deal. Crane would have put up the fee. Ryan made sure the cops were looking the other way. And the mayor, he just sits back and takes a percentage. It's a tangled web, Peter. It's not as simple as there's bad guys there. Let's defeat the bad guys, and the whole system gets fixed. No, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so when Peter asked the question, why do they call him the Goblin? The response of Ben is, no one really knows, right? Like, he's a man of many mysteries. He chose to trawl through every broken down circus and carnival freak show to put his gang together. The enforcers were all carnies. Craven was an animal trainer. The Vulture was a geek. Before the Goblin found him, he was living in a cage, biting the heads off chickens. You do not ever want to cross the vulture. And that's where things get interesting here, because when the goblin walks up to the table and addresses Ben Urich, number one, it seems as though they're aware of each other on a way that is more than casual. The second is that Peter, in his frustration, when Norman realizes who Peter is and talks to him about, hey man, I'm sorry what happened to your uncle, because Peter's so sure that the goblin's guys are the ones who did it, he literally throws a drink at his face. Right now, of course, they're kicked out of the speakeasy because of it, because at this point, it's neutral territory, so much as it can be when you're talking about this kind of an environment. But what Ben Urich realizes is that Peter has passion, Peter has drive, and this is the benefit of youthful arrogance, right? The belief that you have it all figured out, even though you haven't even figured out anything at all. It's the drive to do something. And so that's where Ben tells him, if you really want to have an impact and you really want to make a meaningful change, come with me. And Ben takes Peter to meet J. Jonah Jameson. And the conversation goes exactly as you would expect to, right? You want to join the Fourth Estate. And Peter's just kind of like, I just want to study, right? But Jameson tells him, yeah, that's cool, but you cannot afford college tuition. So you're going to work for me until you can, right? And here's the thing, and this is what's really cool about Jameson. He's not this guy who's just like an arrogant jerk, like he is in the main Marvel universe. He tells him, there's millions of sob stories out there, Peter, and the reality here is that if we don't report about it, nobody will. And everybody will just kind of go on about their day, ignoring that entire homeless side that exists out there. Because if they ignore the problem, well, then the problem doesn't exist. But if we publish it, if we put it in the paper, they have to see it. They cannot ignore it and they cannot reject it, as uncomfortable as it may be. And so even if they close the page and just choose to do nothing about that whole situation, it comes down to the same thing. It's them accepting the fact that they're making a conscious decision to say, I don't care. Now, it's also not that simple. And that's one of the things that Jameson also kind of hits at here when he says, a picture, my boy, can be worth 10,000 words. And I'm speaking as a man who built his entire career on words. I can give them the facts and figures, but it's Ben's pictures that get them right there. Because when a person is looking at that, there's also the part of them that asks the question, what can I do? Because it's not as simple as saying they just don't care, right, and walking away. If you're cynical, sure. But there are a lot of people out there that don't know what to do. And even if they did know what to do, they don't have the means to do it, right? And so ultimately they go about their day. But regardless of how you slice it, Peter joins Jameson, and it's pretty dope, right? That Ben Urich is the one taking all the pictures, and he says, I watched Peter as we went looking for the broken heart of the city. The anger I had already seen in him burned fiercer with every injustice he witnessed. I saw myself in him, the way that I was when I still had the idealism and the arrogance of youth, when I still believed I could change the world. One night, we had a tip-off from a cop, a suicide. The poor sap owed money to the goblin. They threatened his family if he didn't pay up, so he took the only way out. He told his wife in his farewell letter that if he was dead, they'd leave her alone. He had it all wrong. His wife will inherit the debt. The goblin always gets paid. And that's where Peter is starting to see the reality of the world he lives in, as opposed to the world he thinks he lives in. It's much darker than it was, and it's much more difficult to navigate than he thought it was. But what's crazy is he also starts to fill Ben Urich in on everything that had happened with the death of Uncle Ben, that he tells him, right? There were rope marks. They tied him up so he couldn't fight back when they beat him. And while he was still alive, they set wild dogs on him that tore him apart. And Ben just kind of thinks to himself, right? It was old news to me. I knew how he died. What I didn't know was that it was Peter who found his uncle's mutilated body. And he says, I thought that I had it bad, but I never went through half the pain and loss that's been thrown into that kid's life. The truth is, Peter has every reason to become bitter and twisted and cynical, every reason to give in and to let the corruption eat his soul. The truth is, some of us are strong and some of us are so terribly weak. And what he's talking about here is himself. Right? Ben Urich is describing himself. Peter is everything that he is no longer able to be. That now we end up learning that Ben Urich is an alcoholic. He's a drug addict. He's shooting up, right? This guy considers himself to be a very weak person, but he also says Peter was wrong about one thing. It was not dogs that tore Ben Parker to pieces. All those years in the freak show, being treated like an animal, something happened to Adrian Toombs somewhere along the line. The last of his humanity finally slipped away. Sometime, somehow, he developed the taste for human meat. And how do I know this? How do I know that Ben Parker's living body was cannibalized? Because God help me, I was there. Ben Urich watched it all go down, along with all the other members of the Goblin's family. Peter was right the entire time. Peter 100% nailed that the Goblin was behind it all. And so following that, right, we pick up with Ben and Peter responding to a fire that's broken out in an apartment. And Ben fills Peter in on what's actually going on here as opposed to what it looks like. He says, here's how it works, Peter. People don't have jobs. They don't have money for rent. So the rents are lowered and the slumlords pack in more tenants to make up the shortfall. But things keep on getting tougher. Every month, there are more rent arrears. The landlord business is failing, but they can't sell up because who wants a building crammed to the rafters with the dregs of humanity? On the other hand, if the louse trap should happen to burn down, the landlord walks away with a big fat paycheck from the insurance company. Problem solved. And that's where Peter just asked. So the building was torched, right? A little girl died. That's murder. And the response of Ben, with the number of people who were packed in there, it's a miracle it was only one. But he's basically teaching Peter, this is an insurance scam. And it happens all the time. They do it all the time in the city of New York. And even Peter comments on this. You're not even shocked, right? And the response of Urich, right? Peter, I'm too tired, right? You cannot spend your life being disgusted and outraged. You'll go crazy. And he says, what I just told you is a theory. It's probably true, but you cannot prove it, and neither can I. And so Peter, in turn, looks at one of the pictures that have been developed by Ben and says, that's Fancy Dan, right? That's one of the Goblin's people who did this, because Fancy Dan was the one at the beginning of the story that was shouting at Aunt May to get off her soapbox. But at the end of the day, just because he was there doesn't mean he was behind it. He probably was, but as anybody will tell you, it's not about what you know. It's about what you can prove in court. And that's where Ben Urich just tells him, maybe he was. Maybe he was just passing by. And Peter says, we have to take this to the cops. They have to be investigating this fire. And the response of Ben, there's no point. I told you, everyone takes their cut. Cops, insurance investigators, everybody. Now, there is a very deep cynicism and almost nihilism within Ben Urich. He doesn't believe the fight's worth fighting, which really begs the question, if that's the case, why does he work as a reporter? Why does he do his job in documenting all of this? And
like the man just said, everybody already taking their cut. So the same police officer you can go try to tell is already getting paid for niggas like you coming by. Yeah, you go try to drop a report, you missing.
So Peter's response to this is that there has to be someone who will do something. And the response of Ben, the corruption goes all the way to the top. There's no one to go to, at least nobody with any meaningful power. And so at that point, Peter kind of goes on this bit of a tangent. And he says, my Uncle Ben was a pilot in the Great War. Did you know that? He said there was no reason to be fighting, no great cause. It was a war for markets, the old colonial empires carving up the world. And they sent boys out to die by the millions to safeguard their profits. And so Ben's just kind of like, look, I don't see what any of this has to do with the Great War. And the response of Peter, he said, if those in power can't be trusted, it's the responsibility of the people to remove them. And Ben kind of talks to himself for a second and says, I should have bitten my tongue. Peter worships the memory of his uncle, and all I could do was mock his words. Because what Ben Urich says is, that's a nice speech, but while we're waiting for the revolution, maybe you could get these pictures over to the Daily Bugle, right? He just kind of dismisses him, right? It doesn't really take him all that seriously. The problem is that Peter ends up showing up to Ben Urich's apartment later on that night when they've made the late edition, and that's when he realizes Ben is an alcoholic and a drug addict. Right? Peter actually sees what's going on with Ben. Not only that, Ben Urich gets a call, right? And Ben basically goes by the name The Spider. And it turns out that it's basically a tip on where crime is going to be going down. And they say, the action's going off at 1 o'clock in the morning. The Rooney Imports warehouse on Pier 57. Goblin's goons are picking up a shipment of antiques that went astray on its way to the Metropolitan Museum. The usual terms, 40 clams if you use it or not. I gotta go. And it's almost a kind of Nightcrawler type thing if you ever saw that movie. He's given information about where these things are going to be going down. He goes there, he gets pictures and everything, documents it, and then seemingly that information gets used. It's a great big huge circular event, right? Everyone is on the take. And so what you do is you switch over to this warehouse, and they're basically moving these old ceremonial statues. But there's a kind of rumor, a story around them, that those individuals who touch them will die. And so as they're kind of going on and, doing their thing, that one of the boxes falls and breaks open. And when that happens, literally all these spiders come out of nowhere and just completely destroy one of these guys. In fact, it's Fancy Dan who's dead, the one guy they spotted at the pier fire, almost as if it's kismet, right? But the whole time, Peter's there watching. And so one of the spiders ends up making their way up to Peter and bites him on the hand. Now, here's the cool thing. It's not some crazed, grandiose thing, right? Where he goes through like this great big huge montage of learning how to use his powers. It's very grounded, right? It's at least as grounded as a Spider-Man story can be. The spider bites him, and then he gets this vision of this giant spider that talks to him and says, "Why do you tremble, little man? My bite brings death only to those of evil intent. I will bestow on you a greater torment, the curse of power." And so literally Peter's encased in a web. And then once he wakes up, he basically falls out of it. It's him basically learning that he has abilities. But notice this, it only happens over the span of like a splash page and then a handful of panels on another page. That's it. His spider sense does kick off momentarily as he's falling out of the cocoon and then climbs back up before he jumps off. But the fact is, right, like the demonstration of his abilities happens with a quickness because it's Spider-Man. You don't really need like some grandiose explanation of how he got his powers. And so what ends up happening is that after Peter's speech the other night, that Ben Urich was kind of thinking about it, and then he shows up to confront the Goblin. And in fact, he brings the picture of Fancy Dan standing outside the burning building. And the Goblin just says, "Fancy Dan doesn't work for me anymore." Right? Because Fancy Dan's dead. But that's when Urich tells him, "Look, man, I've got enough dirt to bury your entire freak show." And the response of Norman is calm, right? "This is true. And I'm a pragmatist, Urich, just like you. I will buy your snapshot this time. I know you have your needs, but you should take care not to push me too far. So here's 50 skins. It should keep you snowed up for Christmas. Now scram, because Ben Urich is on the take with Norman Osborn." And when he was saying everyone's on the take, he was talking about himself. He was doing it in a little clandestine way. Maybe people would pick up on it, maybe he wouldn't, but he was still hinting at himself nonetheless. The kicker is that Peter shows up here and probably one of the dopest outfits ever, right? He's literally just kind of got like this bandana tied over his face with eye holes on it, and it's pretty baller. Right? But the fact is, he shows up here and confronts Osborn and says, "I'm here to give you a message, Goblin. It all stops. The extortion, the drugs, the prostitution, the protection rackets, all of it ends." And when he goes to like web up one of the guys who tries to attack him, Norman Osborn calls him out, right? "Are you ready to do that?" And Peter hesitates, but then he looks over and he sees Ben Urich, and Ben just takes off running. And so Peter, being distracted, abandons the whole thing with Norman and goes directly after Ben. And he tells him, "How could you, right? How could you be doing this? How could you take his filthy money? You're a drunk and a junkie, and he bought you. He bought you just like a dog." And it's never really that simple. But from Peter's perspective, it is, again, the arrogance of youth. Half the facts with all of the self-assurance. And so that's where he just screams at Ben, "Don't ever talk to me again," and takes off running. Now, of course, it ends up having Norman Osborn's guys who come out and start firing at Peter. But the fact is, right, Norman Osborn just kind of stands there, looks at Ben and says, "Are you still here?" Right, and I'll tell you what, use your connections, find out who that lunatic in the mask is, and you'll earn yourself a nice fat bonus. And Ben just looks at Norman and just says, "I don't work for you, and I don't want your money anymore. I am finished with all of this." And at that point, he takes off. Now, there is a moment when they can kill him, but ultimately, Norman decides not to. He decides to hold off. One, because they can follow Ben, and they can use his whole detective skills, such as they are, to figure out who Peter Parker actually is, and take them both out in one fell swoop. But the other part of that is that Urich has all that information on Norman, and Norman doesn't know where Ben keeps it. And so what ends up happening is that Ben calls up J. Jonah Jameson, right? And Jameson's just like, "What have you got for me?" Right? And Ben tells him, "It's the big one, Jonah. This is Pulitzer material. It's gonna blow this town apart." Jameson just tells him, "Look, man, I don't have time for games. What's the story?" And Ben tells him, "The Goblin. I'm giving you the Goblin." And the response of Jameson is, "Are you serious?" Because this would make his newspaper, right? I mean, this would send him into prime time. And so Ben just tells him, "I'm dead serious, right? I have it all right here. Names, dates, photographs. I can put him in the frame for a dozen murders and tie him to half the rackets in the state of New York." And so at that point, Jameson asks him, "Where are you?" Right? And Ben just says, "In my apartment." Right? I wanted to be sure that you'll be there when I bring this in. And so the response of Jameson, look, man, I'll come and find you, right? If this is the case, I will come to you because they know where I work and technically they know where you live, but we can work out something, right? And so in that moment, there's a knock on the door of Ben Urich. And when he goes to answer it, a gun gets pulled. They shoot Ben Urich, kill him on the spot, and you end up finding out it's J. Jonah Jameson. Jameson is on the take with Norman Osborn. Everyone is on the take. That's the bonkers thing about this. Now, Peter has also developed his Spider-Man Noir suit, which you guys are all familiar with, but it looks fantastic. It looks absolutely amazing. And so at that point, Peter just kind of talks to himself, right? Okay, I was bitten by a spider. I dreamed some kind of mythical spider god gave me superhuman powers. Now I can shoot liquid silk out of my wrists, and there has to be a scientific explanation for this, right? Whatever this is, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it to bring down the goblin. And you're going to help me, Ben Urich, whether you like it or not, because I cannot do this by myself. And when he gets to Ben Urich's apartment, Ben's dead. Right? Not only that, once he calls it in, one of the crazy parts of the conversation is the cops ask the question. So the kid Parker, right, he finds the door open, his pal Urich is dead, the place has been ransacked. How are we going with this? Can we pin it on the kid? Can we frame him for being the one to do it? Right, now maybe they simply just mean, is there some way to tie the kid to it, right? Do we know whether or not he actually did it? But given the context of the story, I'm inclined to believe they were trying to find a way to frame Peter, right? But at the end of the day, one of the other detectives just says no, right? He's the one that called it in. The DA won't buy it, right? It just looks like an unsolved crime to me. And they kind of run over these scenarios. Well, I mean, honestly, Ben Urich was a drug addict, right? Maybe he had some kind of a deal go wrong with his drug dealer, or somebody broke in looking to take his stash. You never quite know how it happens with these sort of things, right? So open and shut case, Johnson. A drug addict got killed in the poor part of town. No more reason to look any further. That's it. Right, that's all it is. But the crazy thing is that Jameson shows up to Norman Osborn and shows him whatever little documentation he could get from Ben Urich, and also just basically a front page of the paper. But Norman's pissed, right? He was like, this is the best that you can give me. He's been collecting everything on me for years, and this is all you could find, right? Some scraps of paper. No. I want the real deal. I want the actual information. I want all the information out there that he has that could bring me down and destroy me. The question that Norman asks after that is, who would Ben Urich trust? Who does Ben trust more than anyone? That's where you start. And so what ends up happening is that as Peter's making his way through, it looks like Lonnie Lincoln. It looks like Tombstone, the bodyguard that actually ends up stopping him. But honestly, it's not even that big of a deal if it is, because he doesn't play a meaningful role. The whole reason Peter's here is because he's being invited inside by Felicia Hardy. Now, one of the things that we did learn was that Felicia Hardy had a romantic relationship with Ben Urich in the past. We didn't really know how deep it went, but we knew there was a romantic relationship between the two, right? Ben basically said he asked her to marry him, and she shot him down. But the point is, right, once Peter gets inside and meets with Felicia, she says, Peter, I know what you thought of Ben, but he called me last night and told me that you knew about the drugs, that he was taking money from the goblin. Ben was no saint. I know that better than most people, but he was a better man than you think he was, and he was very fond of you, Peter. And where Peter goes to speak and say, oh, I know, she cuts him off, right? She says, what you don't know is that he was going to risk everything to expose the goblin and the rest of those scum. That's why he died. It was because of you, Peter. He died for you. Ben had no secrets from me. In this safe are his files on the goblin, all his activities, his associates, names, dates, photographs. He told me if anything happened to him that you would know what to do with them. And so Peter asks, right, like, should I take them to the Daily Bugle? And Felicia's like, no, you do not take, that's the last place you should be taking them. You don't show them to Jonah. You don't show them to anyone. You use them. Ben said that you would know how. And so following that, you pick up in Queens, right, during the funeral of Ben Urich. Of course, J. Jonah Jameson's there, and he approaches Peter, right, because again, Peter has had some work with Jameson. And he's like, oh, it's a tragic loss, right? It must have been upsetting for you, right, finding him like that. And he says, you and Urich, right, you've been close these last few weeks. And Peter's just kind of like, I guess, right? And the response to Jameson, did he take you into his confidence at all. And that's where Peter's spider sense kicks off, right? It's just kind of a warning that there's something nefarious happening here. He says, there it is again, that weird tingling, like something's creeping up on me. There's something off about Jameson. He's scared of something. And so Jameson continues on, right? You see, he was working on an assignment, an undercover thing. Did he mention that to you, right? And Peter just says, no. Right, he never said. He was a very private person. Now, Felicia's watching all of this, right? But Peter clearly doesn't trust Jameson. But it's the Godfather, right? When Tessio comes to Michael, at least I think it was Tessio, comes to Michael and tells him, hey, Bazzini wants to set up a meeting. He was told by Vito, the person who does that is the traitor. And that's why Michael had him killed. That's what's going on here, right? It's literally one of these things where Jameson's approaching him as a friend, pretending to be an ally. All the while, you know that he's on the take, and Peter knows that something's off. Being warned by Felicia Hardy, she kind of gives him a nod, and he continues on. Now, what he says is that Felicia was right. I can't trust Jameson. I can't trust anybody. This is something that I have to do alone. And he says, but it all makes sense now. Getting bitten by that spider, what it did to me, there's a purpose to it. Every night, I'm going to be out here, and every night, I'll hit the goblin where it hurts. And that's exactly what he does. He starts taking all these pot shots at Norman Osborn's forces and all the easily accessible operations that in some instances are happening out in broad daylight. Now, Jameson is, of course, publishing all these instances of the Daily Bugle. The Spider Menace, right? Spider-Man's a menace. Who's this Spider Menace? Painting him out to be a monster and trying to turn the general public against him. But the point is that Norman's whole goal here in seeing this is, it's time to clean house. I'm tired of playing games. Anybody who's been associated with Ben Urich, anybody who knew Ben Urich, anybody who might know the person who knows the person that sold a candy bar to Ben Urich once, I want them in here. We're taking everybody out. Right, we're done, right? Today we settle all family business, so to speak. And so Peter, continuing on, basically ends up coming across the apartment of J. Jonah Jameson. And when he's in there, Jameson asks him, you come to kill me, right? It must be open season, because Jameson's basically been shot right through the chest. He's still kind of alive, but basically dying. And Peter asks, did the goblin do this to you? What did he have on you, Jameson? And Jameson just says, he's the master of disguise. You will not believe your eyes, and dies before he can finish anything else. And at that moment, the cops bust in. And Peter, of course, ends up escaping, but he realizes it has to have been some kind of a setup. Somebody must have told the cops that he was coming there. But then when he thinks about it, he realizes nobody knew I was coming. So it could simply just be one of these things where it was just, I happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, whatever. He's somewhat dismissive of it. The other thing he realizes is that when he got shot, that he doesn't actually feel the pain in any meaningful way. He says, I'd been shot and I didn't even feel it. That bullet could have gone through my head, right? And so once he starts to fix himself, he sits down looking at all these clues. I am missing something about Jameson. What did the goblin have to make the old goat sell out his principles? There has to be something in Urich's files, right? There's Adrian Toombs, there's Craven the Hunter, but that's when Peter starts to pick together all the pieces, and he comes up on something that we weren't aware of before. So he ends up going into the morgue, the dead body of J. Jonah Jameson. And as he starts to study it and analyze it, he realizes it's not Jameson. He says whoever performs the autopsy on this corpse is in for a big surprise, because as he was going through the dossier that contained the various henchmen, for lack of a better word, of the goblin, he says, Dmitri, right, aka Chameleon, Russian half-brother of Craven. He has the ability to mold his features in perfect imitation of any subject. The goblin recruited all his inner circle from circuses and freak shows. Craven's half-brother had to be one of them. This must have been the Chameleon's greatest performance. The question is, what happened to the real J. Jonah Jameson? And it turns out that Osborn is holding Jameson, and has been for quite some time. Now, we're not really given an exact period of time that he's been holding Jameson here, but given the nature of Jameson, that he would never be on the take for someone like Norman Osborn, and the fact that Osborn had control of the Daily Bugle, that seemingly he's had control of him since before the story started, or at least shortly after the story began. But at the end of the day, it really makes no difference. The most important thing about all this is that Jameson's not dead, and Jameson wasn't actually on the take. So those of you guys who love J. Jonah Jameson and felt betrayed by the way the story was being written, rest easy, right? You can calm down. But the funny thing is they've also brought in Felicia Hardy. But the thing is, not only have they brought in Felicia Hardy, Norman Osborn sent his guys, specifically the Vulture, to go after Aunt May. And Peter Parker, in realizing this and in his anger, shows up here and just says, "Let her go, Toomes." And Toomes just like the Spider-Man, right? "How fast do you move, Spider? Fast enough to stop me from snapping her neck, I wonder?" And Peter just says no, probably not, and draws a gun and just points it at Adrian Toomes. And Aunt May's just like, "Oh my God, no." And she says, "Don't shoot." But at that point, Peter just starts having these recollections of Uncle Ben being literally torn apart by the Vulture and guns him down. He literally guns him down on the spot. And the response of Aunt May, "You killed him. You shot an unarmed man, right? Just who do you think you are?" And the response of Peter, Aunt May not really knowing that Peter's Spider-Man, just says, "He was going to kill you," right? She says, "They say you can shoot spider webs. Why didn't you use those?" And Peter's trying to rationalize it in his mind the entire time. The Goblin sent that piece of trash here, right? He sent that monster to kill you, just like he killed Uncle Ben, right? He's kind of rationalizing his actions. But at the end of the day, the logic of Aunt May overrides it. Right? In this moment of just sadness and seeing not only the world out there, but how a man like Peter, who can make a difference, chooses such a negative route, simply just says, "I don't want to live, right? I don't want to live in a world where people kill one another like animals." And she says, "Do you hear me, young man? I won't have it, right? Give me the gun." And Peter just kind of looks at her, says, "I'm sorry," and then ultimately leaves. And so at that point, he says, "Ben Urich's files call this place the torture house. If the Goblin has kept Jameson alive, he has to be here." And so when Peter's literally going through this place, he's basically just watching, right, as Felicia Hardy is brought to Norman Osborn and so on. But what's really interesting about this, right, is that Felicia Hardy, when she's coming face to face with Osborn, she says, "You can start with an apology, Osborn. Then you can have one of your lackeys call me a cab." And he tells her, right, "I admire your bravado, but it won't do you any good." Ask Jameson. He's been calling down hell and damnation on me all week, but he's still going to die squirming in his own mess. And the funny thing here, right, is that Felicia looks at this and seeing Jameson immediately realizes the person that's dead isn't Jameson. And here's what's so interesting about that, because Norman asks her, "Why are you so shocked? You looked as if you've seen a ghost." And she's like, "Oh, that's right. Jameson was shot dead a few hours back by the Spider-Man. I know because I have informants all over City Hall. But how would you know that Jameson's dead unless the Spider-Man is reporting to you? Is that it, Felicia? Did you send him to kill Jameson?" And that's where Felicia says, "Like you sent Jameson to kill Ben Urich, right? You think you're so smart, don't you?" She says, "I had Ben's files. I kept them right under your nose at the Black Cat. The day he was killed, he told me to bring them to him. He planned to spill everything to the Bugle. I told him he was crazy, but he wasn't listening. I was down there when Ben answered the door, and I saw Jameson shoot him down. I took the files and left by the fire escape. The first chance I got, I went to Jameson's office. I didn't hire anyone to do my dirty work for me. I shot him where he sat. I know that I didn't miss. What are you pulling here, Osborn? If it wasn't Jameson that I shot, then who the hell was it?" And the response of Osborn, "Unfortunately for you, my dear, it was one of my people," right? And that's where Craven steps up and says, "My idiot half-brother, rubbed out by a woman." In the response of Jameson, "I regret this, Felicia. I value our relationship, but the chameleon was one of our own, and I cannot let that go unpunished," right? So he has every intention of killing her. Not only that, when she goes to hit his face, she actually scratches his face, and it starts to peel away. That'll become important here in a second, right? Because it's kind of nuts. But in the middle of this scuffle, when she's about to be thrown in to these man-eating spiders, Peter just literally jumps in and goes after every one of the Goblin's guys. And he takes every single one of them out. The only one that he doesn't take out immediately is Kraven the Hunter. Now, he does like web up the tiger so that it cannot attack J. Jonah Jameson. That's what Norman Osborn was using to terrorize Jameson the entire time. Of course, at the same time, Norman Osborn grabs Felicia. They end up going down a trap door, and he tells him, right, if you follow me, she's dead. And that's when Kraven shows up. And Kraven's just kind of babbling something to Peter. And Peter just says, I have no idea what you just said. If it was I surrender, then you have my sincerest apologies. And literally throws him in, or really kicks him in, to that giant cage of spiders that all just start consuming him alive. And so at that point, you pick up down in the sewers where Norman Osborn's trying to make a break for it with Felicia in tow. Now, Peter, of course, catches up to him.
He says, sorry, Kraven, I didn't even hear what you said, Brodusky, but I'm throwing you in this pit of spiders. Gotta go, Bobby.
And a fight breaks out between the two of them. But in this fight, which is not overly lengthy, it's literally like 2 comic book panels, that Osborn says, so this is it. The itsy bitsy spider gets the drop on the big bad wolf. Before we bring the curtain down on this charade, let's see who's under there. And in that moment, he rips off the mask of Peter Parker. But at the same time that happens, Peter grabs the face of Norman Osborn and tears his face off, which is also a mask. And his whole face is just mutated on the inside. And he says, how about that? It's Yurik's punk. What's the matter, kid? Never been to a freak show? And so Peter just says the Goblin, right? That's why they call you that. And Norman Osborn just says, all my life, when the other kids threw stones in the freak shows, all my life, they called me the Goblin. Now, when they say my name, I hear respect. And the few, the very privileged few who see what this face looks like, they know one of us is going to die. And as you can tell, it's never been me. And he says, so how about it, kid? I see it in your eyes now. You've got what it takes. You've got enough hate. Are you willing to kill me? And for a moment, Peter wants to. Peter wants to kill him on the spot, right? And thinking back to the statement of Aunt May, I don't want to live in a world where people kill one another like animals. He just says, no, I am not going to make this easy for you, Osborn. You're going to stand trial, right? And the response of Osborn, right? You put me in a courtroom, you don't get a fair trial. You get a freak show. And I am never going back into one of those cages again. He tries to shoot Peter. Peter like webs up the gun, so it ends up backfiring on Osborn. But he's like, nobody's going to put me in a cage. That's never going to happen. But what literally goes on here is that he goes to run away, and then he's now met with the spider form of Kraven the Hunter, right? Literally, he's just a man made of living spiders and just immediately goes after Norman Osborn. And Peter says, a couple of years back, Uncle Ben sneaked me into the Frankenstein movie. It gave me nightmares. I woke up and Uncle Ben was holding me in his arms. I expected him to tell me there's no such thing as monsters, but I guess he figured I was old enough to know better. So he did the next best thing. He promised to keep me safe from the monsters. I wish I could have done the same for him. And so in the aftermath of all of this, 2 months later, it is an absolute nightmare. One of the biggest crackdowns in the state of New York. Political officials, police officers, the whole 9 yards. They're all literally brought in for charges on corruption at basically the highest levels. And where Peter does show up to meet with Felicia Hardy, it's for 2 things. The first one was to ask the question, the relationship you said you had with Ben Urich, did you leave him for Norman Osborn? And her response is, what happened between myself and Osborn, it's a long and complicated story, and honestly, it's none of your damn business. What other reason do you have to be here? She shuts him down with a quickness, and he says, I found something among Ben's papers, and I thought that you should have it. And it's an old picture of the 2 of them, right? It's a beautiful moment. And so at that point, he just says, the long, cold winter has finally ended. The Goblin and his cronies are dead or in custody. Roosevelt is in the White House, and J. Jonah Jameson is once more sounding the clarion call for liberty and equality from every newsstand in the city. It looks like nothing but good times ahead. Even so, Aunt May is still on her soapbox, still fighting for the rights of the common people. She knows that there are still plenty of bad guys out there. The monsters are always with us, but that's okay, because there will always be good guys too. And in the end, when all is said and done, good guys always win. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. This is the first 4 issues, right? Now, there is a whole second volume, and there's even more that comes after this. So let me know if you guys are interested in the rest. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.